A very good morning from our side. Welcome to this webinar, introductory webinar on human rights due diligence. This webinar is a start of a training program on human rights due diligence, which is offered by the Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein. And we as Focusright are the implementing partner of the Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein. Focusright is a small consultancy firm based in Zurich, which is mainly focusing on human rights due diligence, working with private sector, public organizations, but also international organizations. I'm happy to be here today with Sibylle, my colleague, and also Jelinka in the background. We will start this webinar now. Just for the beginning, very brief housekeeping notes. As you have probably seen, this session will be recorded and the slides will be made available after this webinar. I kindly ask you to mute yourself during the webinar so that we can avoid any background noises. Obviously, if you want to say something, then you have to unmute yourself. Ideally, you also activate the cameras and videos before you make an intervention so that we can at least see a face if somebody is talking. If during the webinar you have any questions, remarks, you can use the chat function. And Jelinka and the team will make sure that we can also reply to your questions, and we can also try to take them up at the end of the session. So really, if you have questions, comments, use the chat function throughout the webinar, and we will try to answer them as we go. I'd like to hand over now to Alice. To give a short introduction on the Global Compact Network, Switzerland and Liechtenstein. So please, Alice.
Hi, everyone, and a warm welcome from my side as well. I'm Alice. I'm a project manager at the Global Compact Network, Switzerland and Liechtenstein. It is a pleasure to start this webinar this morning with all of you. As you're probably aware, the mission of the UN Global Compact is to support companies in implementing the 10 principles in the fields of human and workers' rights, environment, and anti-corruption. Since one of our main focus is human rights due diligence, and in view of in Switzerland on the Responsible Business Initiative, we have created for the second time and together with Focusright, a series of events aimed at enabling our member companies so that they can conduct thorough human rights due diligence in their companies. This webinar is the first event of this second series. And as you can see on the slide, it will be followed by 4 further events until January 2021. So the next webinar, due to take place on 9th of November, will focus on commitment and communication. And then we will have a one-day training also in November. And then at the beginning of December, just a few days after the votation will have taken place, we will have a webinar on the results of the votation and what does it mean for companies in Switzerland. In January, we will have again a one-day training workshop. So you are all of you very welcome to register to all these events. And that's all from my side. I wish you all a very good event today.
Thank you very much, Alice. So just to warm up a little bit and to know who is in this the workshop or seminar this morning, we just have prepared 3 very short questions to you. You can use the function to answer the following question. The first one would be asking you in which sector you are working in. Please use the chat function just to give us some indication in which sectors you are working in. So we have a person from a bank, educational sector. Some more coming up. The second question would be, how many employees does your company and or organization have? So we have a little bit an indication on the size of the company. Some answers are dropping in still on the sector. So we have energy and infrastructure service company, ESG consultancy, association work. The company size is certainly more than 1,000 up to 10,000. And then the last question to you would be, why did you join this webinar? What is your motivation to join the next hour? What do you want to learn? What is your motivation? To enrich and learn is one answer. A new member of the Global Compact who is eager to learn about human rights due diligence. So if we look, then thank you for your brief answers. If we look into the learning objectives of today's webinar, I think we have agreed with the Global Compact that we have three main learning objectives. One is that you will get an overview, a brief overview on international requirements of the UNGPs and OECD guidelines. Learn, as Alice already mentioned, a little bit the development in Switzerland, the national action plans and on business and human rights, but also in a European context. We will focus today on a risk assessment, on how a company can assess human rights risks for a company, because this is often an element that is the most probably difficult one to start with. Also then to define follow-up actions. And then, as we have seen, it's also a preparation for the one-day training who will be offered in November and January, where we will obviously have much more time to deep dive and to develop also concrete measures based on a risk assessment. So those are the three main learning objectives of today. And now I would like to hand over to my colleague Sibylle, who will give you an overview on legal developments in Europe, but also in Switzerland, and also tell you a bit more about what human rights due diligence it's all about. So please, Sibylle.
Thank you, Matthias. Thank you, the Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein, for organizing this webinar together with us. I will first just give you an overview. You see on the current slide, you see a latest update of what legal human rights due diligence developments in Europe look like. So maybe just to pick out a few, we have in Germany, we have big discussions going on potential so-called Lieferkettengesetz, which is not yet adopted. So the parliament is currently discussing. We have some legal developments already in France, in the Netherlands, on mandatory human rights due diligence. And the commissioner in the EU has announced a draft legislative proposal at EU level for the coming year. So you can also then use this overview if you want to deep dive more, and we will also share the slides afterwards. So this is just to give you an indication on how different countries are reacting to legal or are reacting in terms of legal requirements in their countries. Other countries are focusing mostly on implementing the international requirements through so-called national action plans on business and human rights. We currently have I think now it's even 25 states. So last week, the Japanese government adopted the last National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. So many countries are either in the development, it's the blue ones, or have already published so-called national plans on business and human rights. Most of them, like Germany and Switzerland, who adopted one in December 2016 each, use these plans to promote human rights due diligence by companies, but on a voluntary basis. So not asking for mandatory requirements from companies, but strongly encouraging them to implement human rights due diligence within their operations and their value chains. The Swiss National Action Plan has been revised this year in January and published this year in January. The German one is actually now also being revised currently. Many of you who are based in Switzerland have certainly followed the current debates around the so-called Swiss Responsible Business Initiative, which we will vote upon on November 29th. So there will be a public vote on the initiative, which asks for mandatory human rights due diligence enshrined in the Swiss constitution. If this vote is a negative one, so if the Swiss people will vote a no on the Responsible Business Initiative, there is a so-called indirect counter-proposal of the Council of State, which has already been adopted. So this one will come into force if the Responsible Business Initiative is not adopted by the Swiss people, meaning that there will be some kind of requirements for companies in Switzerland soon. The indirect counter-proposal is less stringent, so it's asking for taking over the non-financial reporting directive of the EU, which requires companies to report on topics such as human rights and the environment. And it plans to introduce regulations on conflict minerals and child laborers, following the EU and the Dutch example on child labor due diligence. That's the indirect counter-proposal, which will for sure come into force in Switzerland. But if the people on 29th of November will vote in favor of the Responsible Business Initiative, this will go, the requirements for companies will go further, meaning that companies of a certain size will have to implement due diligence in their operations. So that's just to give you an overview of what's happening in Switzerland currently. I'm sure you have seen that debates are going on currently. But we are now always talking about human rights due diligence. What do we actually mean? What do we talk about? So what we are referring to and what we have seen that the national action plans and also the legislations that are now coming up by national governments, they are always referring to what we call the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which have been adopted in 2011 by the Human Rights Council of the UN. So that's where it's for the first time been outlined what is the responsibility of states, what is the responsibilities of companies related to human rights due diligence. So you see, we're talking about three pillars usually. So the state's duty to protect human rights and the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and then also allowing for access to effective remedy for people who are potentially affected by human rights. Their human rights are affected by operations of companies or their value chains. So what we are mainly referring to in this webinar today is this corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And we will outline today in more details what it actually means and what it could look like for concretely for companies. So the aim of human rights due diligence is really to avoid negative impacts on people and the environment, which are caused directly or indirectly by companies or their operations and business relationships. So what human rights due diligence means is that companies adopt a systematic approach to the S, like the social dimension of CSR. So how to systematically address human rights issues in your operations and your value chains. And it's all about introducing a management system to prioritize risks and to act upon identified risks, and to look into the risks in terms of the risk to the people and not the risk to the company in the first place. Each company's human rights due diligence looks different, so it's individual approaches. Each risk that a company has is different depending on many factors. So it's all about the sustainability or the due diligence to your own company, basing it on continuous improvement. And very important, it's not a ticking the box exercise. So it's not, a company as such cannot be certified for having done due diligence, because due diligence is about continuous improvement. So what are the key elements of human rights due diligence? We are usually referring to 6 elements, which is also in line with the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and also the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. They are in line, they're aligned, so the OECD guidelines have been updated, referring to the UNGPs in their definition of a company's due diligence. So we usually refer to 6 elements, which is a policy commitment. So the company states what it means for them to respect human rights. It means assessing human rights risks and impacts systematically. It means taking measures on risks that you have identified as a company. It also means to take the measures in a way that you embed them in your operations, that you embed it in your daily business. It also means creating transparency on what you do. So talking about the potential impacts you have, talking about the way you're trying to address them. And it means allowing for access to remedy and grievance for people who are potentially affected, so that people who feel they have been affected by your company or their human rights has been affected, they can actually find a way to raise their grievance, and you're developing a dialogue with them. Today, as mentioned before, we will mainly focus on the element of human rights risk and impact assessment, which is one key element of human rights due diligence. You cannot do proper human rights due diligence if you don't systematically assess your risks and impacts. We have seen also in working with companies, but also working on different studies to evaluate what is the implementation of companies in their way they do human rights due diligence. We see that many companies are struggling implementing the human rights risk management system that are in line with the United Nations Guiding Principles. So that's why we're focusing today in a Get Started webinar. We're focusing on the topic of how to approach the risk and impact assessment. So I think I've already shared enough theory on what human rights due diligence is. We want to now, in a more practical way, share with you what it means to address human rights or to evaluate human rights risks and impacts as a company. So we have invented a fictive company, which is we called it Swiss Textile Limited, and we have invited the risk manager of the Swiss Textile Limited company to share with us some elements of their approach to human rights due diligence. So to invite Matthias, or to welcome Matthias as a representative of the Swiss Textile Limited company, risk manager, and please tell us about your company. Who are you? What is your role, and what is your company doing?
Yes, very good. Good morning again from my side. So thank you, Sibylle, for giving us the opportunity to present our company and our work. I'm a risk manager at the Swiss Textile Ltd, which is a company who is based in Switzerland. In Switzerland, we have roughly 1,000 employees, but we have worldwide an approximate number of employees of roughly 8,000. So we are one of the largest textile discounters in Europe, and we have more than 1,000 branches in countries in Europe, such as Switzerland, Poland, Czech Republic, Bulgaria. probably important to mention is that we do not have our own production facilities. So the goods produced that we sell to our customers are mainly produced in countries such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, China, and Turkey.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. I remember your company had some serious incidents, I think 2 years ago in Bangladesh, one of your key suppliers. Are you willing to share with us what happened there?
Yeah, I think it's now more or less public. It went big through the media and news that there was an incident in a factory in Bangladesh when approximately 150 textile workers, mainly women, that's due to the specifics of the sector. So mainly women were killed and more than 50 were heavily injured. This incident happened even though we had an external audit company and an external audit firm who confirmed compliance with national and international regulations concerning occupational health and safety and security. But during the fire, the factory windows and the emergency exits, they were locked, so people could not escape from the fire. So as mentioned, the company where the fire and the incident happened was one of our key suppliers, and it was one of our important partners. And our company then was sued in 2018 by the victims of this fire. So for us as a company, this was obviously a big shock. We believe that the audit firm did the proper works. We realized that we have to go a little bit further than just tier one and ticking boxes with audit companies. So for us, this was really a turning point for the company. And in my role as a risk manager, I then was commissioned to introduce a more systematic approach towards human rights due diligence, which goes beyond auditing.
Okay, this sounds like a big task. So you were the one responsible to react to this crisis. I guess it also, changed some kind of thinking in your company from what you've mentioned before. So what did you do first after this incident, or for introducing the systematic human rights risk and impact assessment?
I think first of all, we started mapping out our value chain, and that was already a new way of thinking, that we do not only look into our tier one and first tier suppliers in the supply chain, but we started mapping out the whole value chain. So as we mapped out the value chain, we looked into for example, the cotton production in the countries, which was obviously has a lot of human rights potential impacts. We then looked into the whole processing part, which includes the fiber production, the wet processing, and textile finishing. Transportation is a very important element of our supply chain, from the production countries to our distribution centers in Germany, and then to further on to our retail stores, as I mentioned, in Bulgaria and Poland. We looked into the whole retail part, including our own shops as well, the franchise partners, because we work with a lot of franchise partners. And last but not least, we also looked into the question of reuse and recycling of the textile. So in reality, obviously, a value chain looks much more difficult when we talk about textile, and also we could do a similar exercise for any other sector. But for us, it was a very good starting point, first of all, to have internal discussions to understand our value chain, and also a good starting point then for mapping out the risks along the value chain.
Okay, thank you. I mean, why did you decide to do that? I mean, based on the incidents, why did you map this value chain, or what did you do with it?
So for us, it was important to understand the potential human rights, or actual and potential human rights risks and impacts along the whole value chain. So in a next step, we basically identified and mapped out all the potential and actual risks for each value chain element with a focus on potentially affected groups. So we used the relevant internal and external sources to assess human rights risks and impacts. So there was a lot of desktop research and consultation with internal and external stakeholders, such as the suppliers and the business partners, but we also talked to the purchasing team, the human resources team. So we actually had a lot of talks internally and externally. And as I mentioned, as a starting point, we considered all human rights in our risk assessment. And we realized then also that traditionally our main focus was from a risk management perspective was mainly on reputational and operational risks. And that meant also that we focused mainly on child labor and working conditions and occupational health and safety, mainly in the first tier supply chain. But we did not really consider community impacts or forced labor, for example, in our supply chain. So this exercise actually helped us to identify risks in agricultural production, such as occupational health and safety, but also environmental impacts on communities. When we talk, for example, about water pollution in the processing part where the incident happened. Obviously, we talked about fair wages, but also environmental impacts, transportation. We looked into working conditions due to long driving hours. The shipping and logistics obviously are linked also to fair wages, but also environmental impact. So this whole exercise helped us to map out potential and actual risks along the value chain, but not only upstream, but also, as you can see in the next slide, we also looked into potential impacts in the whole value chain, in our own retail stores and working with franchising partners in the consumption, but also in the end of life phase of a textile product.
Okay, thank you. I mean, especially on the slide before, where the upstream value chain, it just looked like you have a full list of issues. So, isn't this overwhelming to have such a big list of risks? And I mean, what do you do with it? How do you prioritize?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, when we started mapping out, and you have to look into the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines, obviously, we should basically look into all human rights and consider all human rights. So I think the mapping exercise has helped us to get a better understanding on impacts along the whole value chain, but then obviously you have to prioritize. And me as a risk manager, I'm very much used to work in matrices, as you can see it here. So what we did is basically along the value chain, we started analyzing and assessing the impacts and risks according to high, medium, and low risks along, again, the whole value chain, upstream and downstream. So what was new to me in this whole process was the way to basically analyze the risks and the way we as a company assess severity, which means looking at risks and impacts on people and not necessarily as we did in the past and as many companies still do when we talk about risks, having more a company-centric which looks at the impact of a risk on the company's performance, including reputation and the likelihood. So this change in terms of thinking, having a more people-centric approach, looking more into human rights approach, not necessarily having the company-centric thinking. I think that obviously was also a challenge for me as a risk manager, which basically used to work in a traditional way of thinking. So when we talk about severity and when we started to define severity, the UNGPs and the international frameworks, they basically define 3 elements when we look into severity. One is scale, which answers the question, how important is a negative impact on a human right? The second one is the scope, which answers the question is, how many rights holders are affected. So we're looking into numbers here. And the third question that needs to be answered is the question of remediability, which answers the question, can the impact be remediated? And if yes, in how much time? So those are the three elements that are important to look into when we talk about severity, scale, scope, and remediability.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think to me it still sounds quite technical, and it sounds like, you know, some kind of international requirements. But if you're in a company and you have to now implement the scale, scope, remediability, and defining severity, for me it's still quite abstract. Maybe you can use an example to help us understand better how you assessed. I think this is also how you got into these colors, the high, medium, low. So how did you do that concretely? Maybe you share an example.
Yeah, of course. When you start working on it, it still looks very technical, but actually the approach can help you very much in terms of prioritizing and having a more systematic approach towards human rights. So you can narrow down, obviously, a little bit the scope you have to do. So I think there is a lot of value in looking into this approach. The example I want to give you is probably looking into child labor in the agricultural production. So based on consultations we had, talking to civil society organizations, looking into public available report, we know and we understood that children are exposed to chemicals and therefore also incurable health issues and long-term development deficits in the agricultural production. The number of the cases, so the scope is in our supply chain as we identified it is not huge. So we did not really, we realized that there might be not a very big number being affected in our supply chain because our suppliers introduce quite robust systems, but we could obviously not guarantee that there are no children affected. So the scope might be limited. But on the other hand, if such a case happens, so the issue is considered severe and flagged red because of its scale and irremediability. So if only a handful or 100 children are being affected, then obviously the scale, the impact of the importance of the negative impact is quite big. So the impact on the individual child is big, and also it is irremediable. So that's why we decided to flag it red, because of the scale and its remediability, even though probably the scope might be limited. And this was the exercise we did along the whole value chain. As you can see, the ones that are flagged red and the other ones medium and low. So that was an exercise we did through internal consultations.
So it means you actually took each issue and you thought about each issue in each value chain element, and you reflected on the severity of each issue, and you discussed this internally, or?
Exactly. I mean, I'm a risk manager. I have a certain perspective, and then there are other experts internal. We took different sources, and then with a small core team, with a small core group, we assessed and analyzed the risks and the impacts along the value chain. So it was not only me doing this kind of work, but we had kind of an expert or a core group consisting of procurement, legal, human resources, but also sales and retail. So there were experts and people who know much more about the business operations than I would do as a risk manager.
Okay, and was this a one-off, or are you planning to go through this exercise again?
I think as we understand, I mean, the businesses are changing, our supply chains are changing, the issues are changing. So it's a constant process. It's something we based on the first analysis we did. Obviously, we then identified certain measures and actions, and want to follow up. And actually, this risk analysis is not a one-off exercise, but it's an ongoing work as part of my duty now.
Okay, very good. I think I understand better what you mean by severity now. I'm still seeing a lot of red flags. I'm also seeing that the red flags, if you look at this like slide, you can see that many red flags are actually in your upstream value chain, where, if I've understood correctly, you also have limited influence because you're mainly responsible for the retailing, if I'm not mistaken. How do you deal with this element of being able to influence, or assessing how you can influence, or how are you trying to influence these risks?
Yeah, I think it's a very important and good question, is realizing that most of the issues are in the upstream value chain. Obviously, the question is then, for a company as ours, what can you do? And with the traffic lights in the matrix, we have already then identified the severity of each issue. So we started prioritizing risks and identifying the salient issues, and we used the matrix you can see on the next slide. So in order for us as a Swiss textile to understand how we can manage those risks, we then in a second step needed to identify the leverage, which means our ability as a company to influence different issues. Because as we have seen, most of the issues are in the upstream value chain. So the question for us is, how can we influence those different issues?
Okay, and how do you do that? I mean, how do you assess this leverage or ability to influence?
Again, more on a technical side. Again, the UN guiding principles, they helped us to identify leverage, which means, again, looking into the link to the business. So we again looked into those international frameworks, and again, similar to what we discussed before in terms of severity, there are three elements we looked into. One is if an issue is impacted directly and caused by our own operation. So we talk about causing an impact. The second element is looking into whether you are contributing to an impact together with other actors. So that's the element of contributing. And thirdly, assessing whether you are linked to an impact through your own business relationship. So again, we have three elements: cause, contribute, and link to, which helped us to identify the leverage of our company.
So you did this again for each topic that you had identified before?
Exactly.
Can you give us a concrete example?
Again, probably we then identified the salient issues, and we put them into a matrix. Probably can again start with child labor. So we have an impact on child labor through our business relationships, mainly in the supply chain upstream. And child labor, as we've seen before, is mainly an issue in agriculture and processing. So that's what we have seen in the matrix before. But child labor seems less to be an issue in our own operations, and operations we directly would control, or they would belong to us, such as our own retail store. So that's why we assessed the leverage in terms of child labor, medium to low. Looking into working hours in factories, they can be influenced by our own purchasing practices, the lead times we give to our suppliers, the delivery terms. So we have much more influence on working hours and working conditions in the supply chain through how we do business and how we work with our suppliers. So our leverage here is medium, as we contribute to this risk through our own operations and sourcing strategy. And for example, looking into as a third issue on fair wages and working hours in our own retail stores, which belong to us, so they are our own employees. We have obviously much more influence, and we might cause in our own retail stores issues such as low wages and overtime working hours. But here we still scored it medium because there are also issues happening in our supply chain and not only in our retail stores. So in the supply chain, I would say we are rather contributing to the issue of fair wages and working hours. In our own retail stores, this is directly caused by our own operations. So you can see that many topics are more on the left side of the x-axis, so that our leverage on those risks is, as they are mainly in the supply chain, is medium to low. And I would say this is mainly also due to our business model, as we do not have our own production firms. We would own, and the employees in those production firms are our own employees. Then the leverage obviously would be much higher. But I think important here to say is that even though those issues are more on the x-axis, that does not mean that we should and cannot do anything about those impacts and issues identified.
Okay, so the salient issues are actually the 6 issues that you have in this outer circle. Is this correct? Mm-hmm. So you decided to work on these 6 issues in your process of human rights due diligence. So you have defined measures for each issue for the coming years.
Exactly. So based on the analysis we did, then we identified measures for each of the 6 issues. Again, we worked here with our business partners. So when we talk about the work in the supply chain, obviously we need the buy-in and support from the purchasing team and the logistics team. So because they are partly responsible then for implementing the measures. So when we talk about retail and sales, for example, we were working with human resources and more retail sales and marketing team. So we then, together with our internal stakeholders and internal responsible line managers, defined and identified measures and a concrete follow-up action plan to mitigate the impacts on those issues identified. And then we also looked into existing processes within the company. So we also worked with the internal audit team. We looked with also the audit firms who still do the audits of our suppliers to make sure that they also would consider a more kind of holistic human rights due diligence approach. So there are measures that are being integrated in already existing management processes and existing policies, mainly in occupational health and safety, which was already strongly supported by the management team before the incident happened. So one is to take in concrete follow-up measures, and the other one is really to make sure that human rights due diligence is being integrated in existing management process. So the whole way of doing this work was really helping us to have a more systematic approach towards social issues and human rights in our whole value chain. And we see this as a continuous work. So it's again coming to a management process. You plan, you do, you check, you act. So this plan, do, check, act approach is something we want to continue and hope to have in the long term a positive impact in our value chain.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'm still a bit, I mean, I know, I can imagine that, you know, if you have working hours issue in your company, you work with HR and you try to work on this topic and you try to reduce the working hours or whatever, or salaries. But for me, it's still a bit abstract to think how you as a small company could influence something like forced labor in the agriculture, where you don't even know which cotton fields are actually producing for your company. So, I mean, I understand this is the expectation is that because it's a salient issue, like this example of forced labor, it seems that it is a salient issue for your company, even though you have low leverage, you would be expected to act upon. But I can imagine that this is quite challenging. Also child labor, which you mentioned before, if you have little influence, is there typical kinds of measures that you would take if you have little influence?
Yeah, I think probably the most typical measures we also now are implementing is collaboration. Collaboration with our competitors. In this context, they are more partners, because when we talk about textile, the industry is facing the same issues. So there are organizations, for example, in Germany, there's this Textilbündnis, where all the large or the majority of the businesses are gathering together to make sure they have kind of an approach and a joint approach in along the value chain, realizing that a single company can has a limited leverage. So that's why joining forces with peers, competitors in those business associations is very important. So that's one approach. Then there are certain typical kind of sector associations working on fair cotton, on better cotton initiative, which is developed by the ILO. So there's a lot of work and being done where we just can join in and work with international organizations such as UNICEF when it comes to child labor, work with the ILO when it comes to working conditions in the supply chain, but also then with our peers and competitors to really increase the leverage. That's probably the most typical approach you would have if there is a limited leverage.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much. I think this is very, very practical. And I think already for you as a company to acknowledge that you are somehow linked to those risks and to communicate about it externally was, I guess, already a big step to have this kind of confidence that you can talk about such issues.
Yeah, of course, it's not always easy. I mean, to talk about things going probably wrong or not being perfect in the supply chain, and it also needs an internal kind of change into how you communicate about certain things. And luckily, we have a management team, including communication, which believes that transparency is very important. So we also report on our approaches. We also make sure that we are communicating transparently on what we have achieved, but also probably what we have not achieved. So I think transparency is very important, both for being accountable internally, but also externally. But yes, it is not always easy to talk about forced labor, for example, in a supply chain.
Mm. Okay, thank you very much. I think this leads to some kind of good end of this session. We will have other sessions where we can talk more into details, like what kind of measures can a company take based on, for example, the issues identified, or how to communicate transparently, how to be clear on commitment. I think this was already a very good input into the risk assessment and impact assessment part of the human rights due diligence. So just as a reminder, we today focused on this second element on the right, top right, where we looked into how can a company start with assessing overall risks and impacts. And we already got some inputs from Matthias on how to take measures, how to embed it in the different functions within a company, how to be transparent. So just as a reminder, this risk assessment is just one element of the systematic human rights due diligence approach. I think this is a good point to actually open up the discussion. if any one of the participants would like to ask a question either through the chat, please go ahead, or also if you want to say something, just switch on your video and unmute yourself and feel free to ask your question directly. No one dares to ask any questions. I will keep this open for another few minutes, seconds, I mean, so people can still ask if there is any question that arose during our presentation. Nothing. So I guess then I will hand over to Alice, who can say a few words on the upcoming activities and close this session.
Okay, thank you. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I was actually typing a question, so maybe could you just repeat, Matthias? So in severity, you take into account scale. I think I just missed what do you mean? I missed what does it mean between scale and scope? What is the difference?
When we talk about scale, we look into the impact on a human right. So how important is the negative impact on the human rights? And scope, it's looking at the number of affected people. So how many, in this case, we talked about children might be affected, and the scale. So give you an
maybe an example.
Try to give you an example. Yeah. If
maybe I can jump in with an example. Like you would have like this 1 day of rest per week, which is according to the ILO conventions given for employees. Let's say an employee doesn't get this 1 day of rest throughout the year. It's the scale of being impacted is higher than if this happens twice a year, that the person doesn't get the daily rest. So this is the scale. To which extent is the person's human rights impacted in terms of scale? Scope would be the number of people who don't get their daily rest. And if I'm realizing in my company that there's systematically all my employees don't get their daily rest, then it's definitely more severe than if this happens once a year just before Christmas, for example.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, now I have understood. Now I see that there is a question in the chat. Do you see it, Matthias and Sibylle?
Yeah, I can read it aloud. One of the elements in your value chain is processing. Do you also include suppliers of chemicals to, for example, dye factories in your mapping exercise? Matthias, you want to answer as a Swiss textile?
Yeah, I can try. I mean, it is a fictive example, as we mentioned at the beginning. Yes, you would. I mean, what we try to do here is just to give you kind of an aggregated version of a supply chain or a value chain of a textile company. And as I mentioned, it would also look much more complex in reality. And it would be an internal choice to make. But in our experience, it also helps to make it not too complex, because you can always add another element in a value chain. And for as a starting point, it helps to have some sort of aggregated version. But if you would believe, obviously, that chemical suppliers to dye factories are very important actor in your supply chain, then obviously, yes, you would include it. It also depending on the context of the own company. But in general, I would say try to keep it simple at the beginning. It helps you also then to prioritize risks. because if you add already a lot of complexity right from the beginning, then the analysis of severity, but also leverage and coming to the prioritization part might be extremely complex.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. I think, yeah, this simplification is for many companies in the beginning very challenging, and I think that's what we often see when we work with companies, that, you know, having this abstract level and trying to really focus on the most pressing issues first, and each company has such complex value chains, so we're just trying, considering the potential risks, to simplify. And I think the next question that came in from Saru into the same direction. So what about the company who is starting and who cannot like implement immediately a perfect due diligence? I think that's the beauty of the human rights due diligence, also the expectations. It's process oriented, and you can start somewhere as a company and just try to start systematically, and then it's a continuous improvement process. So it's legitimate to say how you have started, why you have prioritized risks, why you have started implementing measures in a certain area, and I think that's, if you do it systematically and if you can show why you have prioritized which risks and why you're taking which measures, then you're on a good track. So actually anyone can start. You don't need to be super ready. It's all about introducing a new thinking in your company. I'm just reading the questions. Question, and how, if any, corporation in the middle of their business can't afford the UNGP's requirements, such as reduce the minimum wage due to, for instance, COVID-19 and effects to their business. Okay, I think one element which we can discuss in more details when we talk about the measures is, for example, procurement can adopt the buying practices, which is not only it's also paying a fair price, paying more, which obviously has an impact on the minimum wage, or more than the minimum wage potentially paid, but it's also about supplier relationships. And now you're mentioning COVID. The question is also, we have seen companies who just reached out to their suppliers in the beginning of the crisis, asking them what's their situation, what do they need, how can you collaborate? I think there is different ways of managing a relationship, and it's all about also adopting more long-term collaborations with your business partners and finding solutions with them. There's one more question. Would your company already be compliant for human rights requirements in case of Konsensverantwortungsinitiative if it would be implemented? So yes, you're referring to the Swiss textile company in this case. The Responsible Business Initiative is actually has two elements. One element is requiring companies to implement due diligence, and the other element is the whole legal questions around can they be brought to court for something that happens. Regarding general due diligence, I think the Swiss textile example would already be quite well organized. So there's quite a systematic approach. Once you have a case, once someone is really approaching a Swiss law court saying that Swiss textile company hasn't done its work, its proper due diligence, in this specific case, you would have to look at, for example, the risk analysis, and the court would check, you know, did the company assess the risk? Was it aware of the risk? What happened in the concrete case? Should the company have had it on the radar? If yes, why did it not? Why was it not on the radar? If it was on the radar, were the measures that the company took sufficient? Also, in the concrete case, you would have someone approaching the Swiss court who most probably, before such a case, would already have had some interaction with the company. So you would also look into how did the Swiss textile company in this concrete case enter into a dialogue with the affected person. So in general, yes, I think the company, the example, is a good management system for human rights due diligence. In the concrete case, the court will have to see if for that concrete topic it was sufficient or not.
Probably just to add, we in the context of the Swiss textile, we jumped directly into the risk analysis as a deep dive, and obviously talking about human rights due diligence, he was also looking to, as Sibylle referred to, what kind of actions have been implemented, whether there has been a grievance and remedy mechanism being in place, what is the policy commitment. So you have to basically make sure that all the elements, all the key elements of a due diligence are being implemented. But I would assume that looking into what we presented as a case, a fictive case of the Swiss textile, when we talk about risk management, it is already quite an advanced management system.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in.
So, I hope that the ones who ask the question are satisfied with the answers. Otherwise, you can still put something in the chat. I have the impression it's the case. So thank you very much. I think we will close the session now, except if good. Okay. So yeah, we will close the session now. I would like to thank Matthias and Sibylle very much for the great work, the great example. As we said, the slides will be sent to you. And also, as said before, we will have more events coming up. So please follow us, and we will send you the information. They are in the slides anyway. And yeah, I wish you all a very nice day, and thanks again. Sibylle, Matthias.
Thank you, everyone, for participating and for staying in.
Thanks a lot. Also to you, Alice, for giving us the opportunity to work with you, and looking forward to the future workshops. So thanks a lot, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.